Hey, Dom.
Hey, Jenna.
Dom, so let me ask you a question. When you hear, if I were to tell you that a president was keeping an enemies list, calling the press the enemy and freezing out reporters, what would you think
Uh,
of?
I'm thinking of Donald Trump.
Yeah, exactly. But apparently, uh, Nixon was doing that way back in the 70s. That's like fuzzy memories for you and like zero memories for me. So it was over our heads. But yeah.
Yeah, it turns out it was a lot of that playbook still getting used today. So it's all come back.
Exactly. But luckily, this week we've actually got a guest who's going to break it all down, how it started, how it evolved, and why it's still happening, and none of us can pick up on it because we're slow. So let's start the show. Hi, I'm Jenna.
And I'm Dom. You know what's funny? Not long ago, we were both breaking news. Now we're
Breaking unemployment records.
exactly just like thousands of other journalists who've been laid off from newsrooms across the country.
Yeah, and after the shock wore off, we kept asking ourselves, what the hell do we do now?
And over many, many cups of coffee,
And maybe a few drinks.
we realized we had a unique opportunity here. Why not pull back the curtain on what's really happening in American media?
Right? I mean, we've spent years in this industry seeing how stories get made or don't, and now we can actually talk about it.
And trust me, there's a lot to talk about. From local news disappearing to social media reshaping journalism, we'll break it all down.
And look, we're not here to lecture anybody. We just want to help make sense of the information that we're getting and maybe have some much needed fun along the way.
So whether you're glued to the news, just trying to figure out what's real in your feed, or curious about the future of media, come hang with us.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking, a podcast where two journalists
Are taking a critical look at American media. So Jenna, before we get into things, I have to say, like last night, Bill Maher was on. He had his show Real Time, and he was talking about the fact that that meeting he had, well, that dinner that he had at Mar-a-Lago with
Oh,
Donald
I
Trump.
saw a picture of that. Twitter was all over that. Twitter was not, at least my Twitter timeline was not amused.
No, same here. But last night during his monologue, he talked about what happened that night. And this is something I was not expecting,
Okay.
especially after years of Bill Maher attacking Trump and the lawsuit that Trump levied against Bill Maher years ago. Anyway, he talked about how he was shocked at how Trump was so gracious and self-aware. They laughed. He said Trump made fun of himself. And at one point, he said that Trump even used the word lost when he was referring to the 2020 election. Um, I mean, Maher said it's not, listen, he never liked the guy before, but that after last night, he thought he was really surprised by the person he was having dinner with. And so he's like, listen, Bill Maher saying, like, I'm still a critic of the guy, but you know what? I just found this to be so interesting that we had a really interesting night. Um, I don't know. How does this make you feel, Jenna?
What you
Because I
talking
have
about, Dominic? That's what it's giving me. It's giving me Gary Coleman from Different Strokes. What?
Jenna, I get it.
It's giving rebrand to me. That's
Yes.
what I'm feeling like. Is that like someone is in need of a rebrand? Someone's approval numbers are apparently in the toilet. And yeah, it feels like it that everything that you just said is giving like smooth over the cracks some, just give it a nice little glaze. It's really not that bad.
But I get
Isn't
it.
the
Bill Maher's
AP
like,
still banned from the White House press pool?
yes,
Okay, so then
yes.
what? I don't care if he like laughed at himself. Like then that makes everything.
It's because I just think like my thing with it is that Bill Maher's like saying, listen, I'm a comedian. Who gives a shit if the fact that I met with him but it's like, but it does matter because it changes. Like when we're talking about having conversations, I get about having conversations with people you disagree with. That's something
Absolutely.
else. That's something else though than what many
Well,
people are
first of all,
going through or
he's not
dealing
just
with.
any old comedian. He's a comedian with a huge platform and
Hmm.
outsized influence.
Hmm.
That's A. And then B, yeah, dude, you're a comedian. And for reasons that we will look to unpack, um, people seem to listen to comedians more than they listen to anyone else.
That's very true. So I found
So,
it,
oh, I'm just a comedian. No, dude, you have an outsized influence on culture.
and I think that doesn't go unnoticed by, you know, Donald Trump. You know what I mean? That does
Of
not go
course.
unnoticed. That everything is definitely purposeful. And I think, like you, as you just mentioned about rebrand, is really on point. But interesting enough, I know you also just mentioned AP before.
Hmm.
So now our headline of the week was this is coming from CBS News, and it's an update on the saga between the Trump administration and the Associated Press, right?
Hmm.
So it was a major win this week for the AP. Right over here, federal judge Trevor McFadden, who was appointed by Trump, apparently, ruled that the White House can't block AP reporters from things like the Oval Office photo shoots and Air Force One trips just because they wouldn't call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America.
Because
Now,
they're an
the
international news outlet.
correct.
Yeah.
And now
And
the
nobody
AP
else is doing this nonsense.
And now the AP still had, of course, during the whole time, they've still had access to daily press briefings. They just were not allowed in those anything within those other areas. But the ruling made it clear, picking and choosing who gets full access based on what they write, that's a First Amendment violation. The judge gave the White House until April 13th to seek an emergency stay from a higher court and start prepping to follow the ruling. The Trump administration filed a notice of appeal the next day. So, I know.
Wait, hold on. File an appeal the next day. So they're still just like, yeah, nah, son, I'm not doing it. This is the thing
Correct.
that I feel like is a growing pattern. This is the reason why, we have had some people on. I've heard a few other scholars go on to news programs and say, yeah, no, we need to stop suggesting and just say this is a constitutional crisis because this administration over and over and over again keeps getting rulings from the court and keeps being like, yeah, I'm not feeling it.
I'm very curious to see how, obviously it's like what happens and if they're going to have to some point, like, I don't know what the next steps are. I just can't believe that it's been since February that this has been going on. So you're talking about a little over 2 months now,
Yeah.
um, that this situation has been going on, and I don't get it. But it's also very interesting because it makes you realize afterwards sometimes too, like this is not new, right?
Nope.
Stuff like this is not new. It's happened in
Mm-mm.
other presidencies, um, specifically as we mentioned in our cold, like Nixon, was doing certain tricks, dirty little tricks.
Yes. Well, I mean, listen, wasn't that his nickname, Tricky Dick?
Yes,
Which is a play on his name, not a
yes,
yes. But that
yes.
was his nickname. No, but it was really fascinating, I think, to find out not only what they were doing, but more importantly, the way that history rhymes. I think that's really what got to me from our conversation was, who were the players during the Nixon administration and what was their lasting impact. I know that one of this administration's big nemesis is of course the entire nation of China, whatever. But one thing that I remember a friend of mine telling me, a friend of mine who used to cover the UN and this was several years ago, like during the Obama years, and had casually mentioned speaking with one of the Chinese ambassadors. And what he said his big takeaway from that conversation was that the Chinese ambassador said, off the record, so I'm repeating this now, but I'm not using names, that Americans think too small, that we think like
Mm.
for immediate gratification, whereas the Chinese tend to think like, 500 years from now, what are going to be the impacts of our decisions today? And to solidify that, this person then said to my friend, the UN reporter, we still don't know the full extent of the impact of the French Revolution. We're still seeing the reverberations of that. And that was the first time that I was like, damn, that is true. And we do. We're
It's
very much, an
yeah,
instant
yeah.
gratification nation. And,
We are.
as soon as it's done, move on to the next as if
Yes.
whatever happened last week is complete. No.
Yeah.
And this
Yeah.
conversation, I think, is an excellent example of how not just the actions, but the players. And considering that we have so many very eager, new, young players in this administration, that maybe we do bother to learn their names.
The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The establishment professors are the enemy. Professors are the enemy. Write that in the blackboard 100 times and never forget it.
Presidents and the press. It's never been a love story. Some complain about coverage, some try to blacklist reporters, some change the rules completely. There's really nothing new about it. The tension has been part of the job for decades. Nixon had an enemies list, and as we heard in that clip at the start, the press is near the top of it. Reagan had a strategy. Even a few Democrats tried to tip the scales. And now we've got Trump picking his battles with the news media, banning outlets, and dragging the Associated Press into court. So, how did we get here? And how much of this is just history repeating itself? To help us trace the roots of it all, we're joined by Rick Perlstein. He's an American historian, a journalist, and the best-selling author of the books Nixonland and Reaganland. Rick, welcome to the show.
Hey guys, it's good to be here.
Thanks, Rick. And so Rick, we open with that clip of Nixon calling the press the enemy. When you look at the long arc of presidential hostility with the media, why does Nixon stand out?
Well, the conservative kind of not I won't say the conservative movement so much because Nixon's relationship to that, but let's just say the kind of conservative attitude towards the press has almost been a primal kind of distrust. These are the people in the metropolis who are kind of telling, the normal salt of the earth folks, behind their white picket fences how to think. This idea that they're kind of some unelected aristocracy, right? So, that's a tradition that he's basically building on that he was very inclined to adopt just because of his psychology. Everything in his politics was kind of based on this idea that he represented this class of Americans who we'll talk about, he later called the silent majority, who are patronized to by these cultural elites. That was just absolutely central to his thinking about the world, really ever since he was in college and he formed his own social club of the kind of outsiders. Because the one social club on campus would let, kind of the lowbrow commuter students like him join. And he really
They had
planted his
something against
flag.
commuter students.
They weren't cool. Think of it like the revenge of the nerds, the poorer kids, really,
Yeah, as one
Uh,
of them, that's why I'm kind of offended.
yeah, yeah. Well, clearly you're not a Nixon fan, and a journalist. So there you go. It's a 1-2 punch. But I mean, basically, the idea that these kind of elite swells, are telling us normal people what to think, right? Very central to conservative thinking. Very central to Nixon. Most famously, are you guys familiar with in 1962 something called the Last Press Conference?
No, but
Oh,
No.
that was a hoot. So Richard Nixon ran for president in 1960 against this really, kind of charming, kind of one of these guys he was up against in college, John F. Kennedy, the cool kid, right?
yes, the tan
And
cool kid, if I remember correctly.
yes, tan, he was, sweaty and grindy. He was a try hard, he was cringe, right? So he lost to John F. Kennedy in a very close race and really believed that it was because all the cool kids were for Kennedy. All the press was against him. And in a way, it was true. Teddy White, who wrote these series of books called The Making of the President that were very widely read and very influential. His first one was 1960, The Making of the President 1960. And he would wear a Kennedy pin onto the Nixon press train, basically in order to troll Nixon. And so he loses.
A
And in
time-honored American
1962,
tradition.
yes, in 1962, he's, at the low ebb of his career. He'd been kind of the fair-haired young boy of the Republican Party, and he runs for governor of California, which is a real come down, right? I mean, from running for president to running for governor, and he loses that too. And on election night, he gets quite drunk, and his press secretary says, "You gotta come down and face the press." And he gives this famous rant in which he says that you guys, you're going to write it however you want because that's what you do. It's very Trumpy, right? They have a real spiritual kinship. And I'm afraid that you're not going to have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore
Uh,
because this is my last press conference. He basically kind of announced his retirement and kind of put it all in the press, blaming them for, just kind of being unfair to normal guys like him. So that's Nixon, right? So by the time he's president, this thing is just kind of locked in. And of course, in 1968, he wins. And, he starts out with a lot of goodwill from the press, but, he squanders it quite early. One of the things he does right away is he starts bugging members of the press because he's so obsessed with leaks. And, the real watershed of this was when there was he kind of 1968 kind of sort of never really kind of was specific about it, but implied that he was going to end the Vietnam War, and that's why you should vote for him. It was, kind of implied that he had a
Wait,
secret
did he
plan to
have
end the war.
concepts of a plan to end the war?
He had concepts of a plan to end the war, and of course, he became president and did no such thing. And the honeymoon was over, and by October of his first year in office in 1969, it was October 15th. It was on a Wednesday, it was on a school day, it was on a work day. This is important because it was called the moratorium against the war. And what it consisted of was millions of Americans all over the country, small towns, big towns, senators were involved, ministers were involved, stayed home from work, stayed home from school, and basically went on strike against the Vietnam War. And it was a massive protest, probably the biggest we've ever had. I've seen estimates as high as 10 million people participating, right? Yeah, your jaw is
No,
dropping, right?
I am. My jaw is dropping simply because, well, there's a lot of people who talk of movements now, but nothing like what you just
Yes.
described.
It was remarkable. I would recommend the Wikipedia page on the moratorium. It's a fascinating moment, and it was a watershed in history because it angered Richard Nixon so much that he'd kind of lost this sort of middle America, or was losing this middle America over the war that he'd kind of claimed was his own. And so he gave this very important watershed of a speech on November 3rd of 1969. And this was the famous silent majority speech. I guess you guys have a clip from it. You want to?
Yeah, actually, we
Yeah, yeah.
do. Dom, do you want to tee it
Yeah,
up?
Jenna. No, go ahead, Jenna. You could.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, yeah. So Nixon, of course, delivered this silent majority speech in November 3rd of 1969. And it's not just about how he was framing the Vietnam War, but also how he was framing the people protesting it, which again,
All right.
I had no idea that there was a protest that big.
Yes.
But anyway, here's a
That
clip
they were
from,
really kind of not quite American. Yes.
yeah, anyway, here's a little bit of what late President Nixon had to say.
For almost 200 years, the policy of this nation has been made under our Constitution by those leaders in the Congress and the White House elected by all the people. If a vocal minority, however fervent its cause, prevails over reason and the will of the majority, this nation has no future as a free society.
Okay, so Rick, what would you say Nixon is trying to do with this speech? I mean, specifically, who is he talking to? And how did this help set up his administration's broader fight with the press?
Right. So what he's trying to do in this speech is create a hard and fast division between kind of regular, normal Americans, the silent majority, the people who don't protest, and these people who are protesting, who, like I say, had revealed themselves as, very much normal Americans. So he's trying to kind of say, who do you believe, me or your lying eyes? And saying that these people, he talks about a sign he claimed to have seen in San Francisco that said, "End the war, lose in Vietnam."
Mhm.
Right. So these people want to humiliate America. They want to turn us over to the communists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You're the silent majority. Now it's a bit of a dog whistle because who are the people we call minorities in America, right?
Mhm.
People who aren't white, black
Yeah.
people.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
silent majority means the white people. Loud minorities are,
Mhm.
these kind of loudmouth people who won't shut up, whether they're the hippies, the commies, the black people, all those people. So something important happens after the speech, though. This really is the high tide of the kind of cultural and moral influence of the three network newscasts, right? These stentorian, old men who, kind of have this amazing kind of cultural confidence to kind of sit on Mount Olympus and tell people how the world works.
Mhm.
And after this speech, when he, kind of claims the monopoly of America's attention, they do something kind of unprecedented because they have this high tide of confidence. Each network kind of has a panel discussion afterwards, and they kind of pick apart the speech, kind of line by line, and they say, "Oh, there's nothing new in the speech," and da da da, and he's doing the same things as Lyndon Johnson. So this is another kind of one of these kind of last press conference moments in which he identifies the press as almost a conspiracy against him, kind of going back to the beginning of his career in the 1940s. And that inaugurates a very intense pushback effort created from the White House, first of all, to create this illusion of popular support. They create this telegram
They got like
basically.
like
Yeah,
80,000
but they
letters,
were
or like,
kind
look,
of,
everybody's
kind of
supporting.
solicited, right? So then
Hmm.
he'd go on TV and say, "Look at all these telegrams. I'm the one that people support, not you guys." And the other thing was he had this vice president who was kind of seen as kind of clownish and kind of second rate, kind of a D-list kind of guy, Spiro Agnew, who was quite a bit more conservative than Nixon was, and really had mastered this rhetoric of us versus them and the elite versus the ordinary Americans. And he had only recently kind of come out of the shadows, that Halloween, actually. He had this kind of really scary speech in which he talked about, how civilization was on the ropes because the hippies and the degenerates were basically taking over. Much more the kind of thing we'd associate with, a Trump
I was
than
going to
Hmm.
say
I would
all
say
of
it's
this
kind of a
feels like a copy paste to the moment we're in
Hmm.
now.
well, I mean, Donald Trump had signs that said support the silent majority in 2016 at his rallies. Yeah. I mean, he's, this is a guy he's going to school on what he remembers from his, when it's
Hmm.
the beginning of his adult life. And yeah, so Agnew was kind of the bad cop, Nixon was kind of the good cop. So what they did after this outrage of the media daring to criticize the president for his war policies was they sent Spiro Agnew on this tour. And Spiro Agnew kind of becomes a superstar. And he has this speechwriter who goes on to become a New York Times columnist. We can get to that, named William Safire. And they have this great kind of team effort. They both love alliterations, they both love big words. And he keeps on coming up with these formulations that, kind of lead the news, that the media are nattering nabobs of negativism, right? He has these great formulations about the three network newscasts as basically um, almost like these aristocracies, right? These unelected uh, elites who, kind of like are coming out of nowhere and again, telling Americans what to think. And that really, sets a template that the Republicans have been dining out on ever since.
And it's also like days after Nixon gives his speech, Agnew goes on the road.
Yep.
And, we have actually a clip of when he addressed, it was like 10 days after, November 13th, 1972, he addressed the Midwestern Regional Republican Conference in Des Moines, Iowa. Let's take a
Nice.
listen to that.
The views of a majority of this fraternity do not, and I repeat, not represent the views of America. And that is why such a great gulf existed between how the nation received the president's address and how the networks reviewed it.
Richard, like what triggered that moment of him, Agnew really attacking the press? I mean, that whole speech is him basically just saying, they're elite, they're a
Yeah.
fraternity,
Right.
they're all after they did, the press,
Right. It
I don't want to
really
talk
kind of
about.
comes out of the vibe of the 1960s that, it was this time of extraordinary social tumult. Lots of protests, lots of norms involving, things like family and sex and how young people don't obey their parents, and obviously the opposition to a war, which you never would have seen during World War II or the Korean War, right? And one of the watersheds for this movement was the Democratic Convention the previous year in 1968, and
Also in
uh,
Chicago.
also in Chicago. And there's a wonderful book about this by a historian named Heather Hendershot, although I write about it in my book Nixon Land too. Let me tell you the story about this. I have a friend who passed away a couple of years ago named Lou Cook. And at that time in 1968, he was a producer for NBC News. And he was, a partisan of, it was kind of just like the accusation that Agnew made. He was a partisan of the civil rights movement. He was a partisan of the anti-war movement. He was just one of these enemies that, they had in mind. And he was given the job because he was kind of a real Chicago street guy of producing the protest footage. And as we know, because it's a very famous moment in history, um, lots of militant protesters came to Chicago. And, long story short, I have a whole chapter just kind of giving a kind of a minute by minute account of this one day, August 28th, 1968. The protesters sat down in the street in front of one of the luxury hotels in Chicago, right downtown, right on the lakefront, called it was the Hilton Hotel, and they had a sit-in, and cops just kind of waded into the city, sit-in and started wailing on people. I mean, it's just really, I mean, you could just, literally just kind of taking their nightsticks and beating people within an inch of their lives. And the protesters start chanting. Do you know what this famous chant was? The
What?
whole world is watching, right?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, I
And
heard that.
yes,
Chicago.
yes, and that was a callback, right? I mean,
Yeah.
this is one of these like high melodrama moments in American
Except it
history.
wasn't a war in Vietnam. Okay, I'm sorry. I just there's so many parallels. It's blowing my mind. Like, and I
Well,
mean play by play.
this is our country, you know? I
Hmm.
mean, this is where the scripts come from, right? And so here's my friend Lou. And he goes back to the office to kind of edit the footage. This is back when they actually literally had to develop the film. It took like a half an hour. And there's no one to answer the phones in the NBC office. And here's this guy who's, he thought what he's witnessed is this triumphant kind of movement in which these martyrs for justice were put on display for the country. He kind of compared it to what happened at Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, right, 1965, right? So then, when George Wallace's cops beat people within an inch of their life, that caused a national outrage and led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. So this is another Selma, and he's drafted into answering the phones, and one after the other. I tell this story in my book Nixon Land. People are saying, why did the protesters provoke the cops like that? Right? It's the protesters' fault. Why is the media showing this? Why is the media telling this story from the perspective of these degenerates instead of,
Hmm.
the forces of law and order? And what they kind of figured out was this is what protests are. They stage these kind of dramatic confrontations with the state. In fact, if you listen to the people on the New Left, they said this was the point of it, to kind of heighten the contradictions between, these people that they thought were fascist and were kind of showing themselves a little bit to be, and the forces of justice. But it was completely the opposite of what Lou thought was going to happen. In fact, it was so traumatizing for him that he like took a year off and basically, had to like leave the profession. But what was happening was this classic showdown, right, between this vision that people have of their nation as just and peaceful and doing the right thing and the right side, and these people who are just tearing that down, supposedly, challenging that. And it caused a real kind of dark night of the soul in the executive suites on kind of Avenue of the Americas in New York, and, like Columbus Circle, where ABC was. They began to ask themselves whether they did have a liberal bias, right? I mean, it was just the real self-flagellation happened, and they decided that they
Interesting.
didn't that all this kind of discourse we hear about the media, um, you know, ignoring the people in the diners, right? I mean, it's kind of in this way, in a lot of ways,
Is
this
this
is
where
kind of
that
like,
one Pennsylvania diner became popular?
right, that's right, that's right. They started showing up in the diners, and they're like, "Oh, we're telling the story of these civil rights people. We're telling the story of these anti-war people. Why aren't we telling the people of, Des Moines, Iowa, right? Why is it
Who,
that,
wait, don't live around, what? Okay.
so history, it's a motherfucker."
Okay,
So,
so
so in a lot of ways, so that's 1968, and that, in a lot of ways, that was where Richard Nixon kind of won the election because paradoxically, even though these people were protesting the Democratic nominee Hubert Humphrey for not coming out against the war, people associated because Nixon did a really good job of drawing the association between all these forces of disorder and the media aristocrats who backed them with the Democratic Party, with liberalism.
my brain hurts. Okay, so
I
here's my
mean, I mean, if you came up in a time and place like mine, I mean, that was the way the world worked, you know?
it's not so much that that's the way the world worked, it's the fact that all of this was just able to literally like play by play happen again.
Oh,
And we all just kind of were like, yeah,
well,
wow, this is so crazy that it's
it
happening.
happens in the 70s. I mean, it happened. That's how, Ronald Reagan got himself elected with the same rhetoric. I mean, you remember Sarah Palin, she was
Mhm.
Oh,
very big
yeah.
on this kind of rhetoric,
Yeah.
Newt Gingrich, same kind of rhetoric. In a lot of ways, it's like I say, it's primal. It's the kind of, sort of cosmopolitan intellectual elite, or Spiro Agnew loved to call them so-called intellectuals, right? Self-described intellectuals. We're the smart ones, right? Rush
Oh,
Limbaugh was very big on that one.
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
sometimes I gotta be honest.
Mhm.
I don't know if the media can help themselves when it comes to we're the smart one.
We're the smart ones. Well, I mean, it comes, I mean, it's not out of thin air, right? I mean, the media, I mean, have the responsibility of, basically taking the chaos of the world and turning it into a story, turning it into a narrative. And right, what are you going to do, right? And in the 60s, the narrative often, because that's what was, interesting, was the forces of protest against the forces of order. And I mean, if you think about the media, TV news especially, kind of coming into its own in the 60s in these kind of melodramas like, Selma in 1965, Birmingham in 1963, um, the Vietnam War, on the air every night. Um, you know, Suddenly it's the first televised war. And even though it's very much exaggerated the extent to which TV news told a story of Vietnam, which was criticizing, the war, you couldn't help it because the war was just such a failure and so unjust. In fact, one of the most, I would say, even to go back even before earlier in 1968, another one of these watersheds was when Walter Cronkite, who, Dominic, maybe you're old enough to remember. Maybe my friend Jenna might be a little too young to remember
I
Walter
just know he's the
Cronkite.
patron saint of
I know
journalism.
He is the patron
that part,
saint.
yes.
He was America's uncle, grandpa. He was the white guy that everyone trusted. He was called the most trusted man in America.
Yeah.
And what he did in 1968 when the communist forces in Vietnam did something called the Tet Offensive, in which they um, embarked on this surprise attack on the South Vietnam capital in Saigon when supposedly America had seen the light at the end of the tunnel and was going to win the war. He went to South Vietnam. He went to Saigon to see for himself, which was a pretty remarkable thing to do. And he gave a very, very rare kind of once in a career editorial in which he said, "This war is a stalemate. We might lose it." And he was the guy from CBS. And one of the things I just wrote about for my next book is the takedown of Dan Rather in 2004, which was a very important kind of chapter in this story, in which he did a very compelling and accurate report on George W. Bush having evaded his National Guard service during Vietnam.
Mhm.
But he
Hmm.
used a document which he was not able to verify, basically a letter from one commander to another saying, I'm sick of covering for this Bush kid, right? And that uh, basically created this mob attack on him that ended up with him losing his job as the anchorman. But in a lot of ways, that was a vendetta that began against CBS News as CBS News was being attacked by the right, not because they were the worst, network, but because they were the best. They were the Tiffany network. They were the
Wow.
ones who were uncovering the evils of society most effectively, right?
Okay,
Um,
so I'm wondering now because, and I don't know where this uh concept or phrase sort of like came into the at least journalism media zeitgeist, but did Nixon have a problem with just press and the concept of press and being challenged
mm,
in general, or was he more into like, you guys are so biased and you're like elitist? I actually want a fair and balanced press that's like honest about
Are you
claiming that that's not what's happening.
are you having fun with me? You know this, right? Roger Ailes was Richard Nixon's
Yes.
media consultant. Yes.
Yes, I'm
Yes.
jumping
Yes,
forward.
I see. Nice. I'll take the bait. This is where this guy Roger Ailes entered this story, and he's a fascinating guy. Also, you guys are not old enough to remember this talk show. It's called the Mike Douglas Show. It was a
I heard
daytime
of.
talk
I've seen
show. Yeah.
clips.
Mike Douglas was kind of the Oprah Winfrey of kind of like the 70s, the 60s, I should say, and the 70s. I remember him, when I was a kid in the 80s. And he had a producer, a young hotshot producer who, like our friend Dom here, kept on winning Emmys. And in 1967, when Richard Nixon was beginning his political campaign, he went on this show for housewives, the Mike Douglas show, recipes, celebrities,
Oh,
and
smart.
he was in the makeup, right? Smart, right?
Yeah.
You and Roger Ailes agree. So he's in the makeup
I worked
trail.
for him briefly.
Yeah, he's in the makeup chair and he's ranting about, the ridiculous things you have to do to become president these days. And Roger Ailes, this young guy, I think he might have been like 28 at the time, just actually read him. He's like, Mr. Vice President, if you think that this is some kind of chore, then you'll never be president. If you had done this sort of thing better in 1960, you would have been president. And Richard Nixon was so impressed with Roger Ailes that he hired him as his media consultant. One of the very best books about how how media manipulation happens in campaigns is called The Selling of the President, 1968, in which Roger Ailes is one of the characters, and the packaging of Richard Nixon. There's a famous Esquire cover from around that time in which supposedly he hadn't worn makeup during the debate with John F. Kennedy in
Oh,
1960,
okay. Yeah.
right? So that was kind of what Ailes, that's kind of the kind of background to this conversation. And on the cover of Esquire, there are all these hands, kind of putting lipstick on him and blush. And so he hires Roger Ailes. Really, literally, you can find memos in the Nixon library of Roger Ailes telling him giving him makeup tips, basically. And Roger Ailes, he doesn't. I don't know if he actually became a White House staffer. I think he might have been an outside consultant. But there's a very famous memo that it's easily Googleable, in which Roger Ailes says, conservatives, Republicans will never get a fair shake on TV. So basically, we have to create our own media institutions. So it's not so much that we, don't want to be covered. It's just that we want our own friendly media institutions. And, that memo from, I think, 1970 or 71, for good reason, is kind of understood as the text of what became Fox News. Roger Ailes went on to, produce Rush Limbaugh's television program. He was a big consultant for Ronald Reagan, obviously a guy who was very serious about his appearances in the media. And Roger Ailes, had the same attitudes about this stuff as Spiro Agnew did. And there have been a lot of attempts kind of along the way to create conservative TV networks on cable. They all failed because they were really created by political junkies who were ideologues who didn't know how to put on a good show. They didn't know how to put on a Michael Douglas show, with the makeup tips and the recipes and the blonde ladies with the long legs and the flashing lights. And Roger Ailes was a genius. When George H.W. Bush, I just you can see this as a really good documentary that I'm in called Rather, about Dan Rather, and Roger Ailes is kind of one of the minor characters. Um, in 1988, when George H.W. Bush was running for president, in a kind of classic showdown between the forces of accountability and cover up, he had been involved in the Iran-Contra scandal. And he
That's
refused to do
right.
any interviews, and he was basically stonewalling. And Dan Rather's like, well, we're doing informational interviews. He was the anchor at that point of CBS News, one of these three towering guys. Uh, and we're going to do interviews with both candidates. And can we, have you in for an interview? And Roger Ailes said, yeah, we'll do it, but we're not going to be in the studio, and it has to be live. And he basically created this scenario in which he knew that Dan Rather, in the guise of doing this kind of general introduction interview, was going to ambush him with Iran-Contra questions. And they had rehearsed this, and he did such a good job of performing this outrage that he had been ambushed. Um, and literally, Roger Ailes was off camera so that not only could the audience at home, you and me, couldn't see him, but Dan Rather couldn't see him. And he was holding up cue cards. He was literally feeding George H.W. Bush his lines. And Dan Rather had both guys were screaming. And the news for next day was that Dan Rather ambushed the vice president of the United States. Not that the vice president of the United States was, lying about violating the Constitution. And this was, again, all Roger Ailes, all coming out of this playbook. And then you get this billionaire from Australia. It's like out of a science fiction movie who decides he's
Mhm.
gonna, kind of brainwash, using the most sophisticated techniques of, lower order thinking by,
My
creating this kind of,
God. It's just
fog of
again.
terror. Yeah, well, this stuff keeps me in business,
I mean,
Jenna.
on one hand, I'm glad. I'm always glad to see people stay working, but my God. No, I guess like we've had conversations, and Dom, I know we have another clip coming up, but very
Yeah.
quickly,
Yeah.
I'm just having this aha moment because we've had conversations about our recent episode about how the right has managed to dominate the online media space. And what I'm
Right.
now putting together in real
It's
time
this
is that
outrage script.
there's been an
Yeah,
understanding of how to work the media versus
right.
another different understanding of like
Right. So
being
what
sort of
what
Well,
what
biased
Richard
within it.
Nixon did with this whole kind of complex was, and again, something I document in my book, is he realized that this kind of guilt that we talked about in 1968, with the
Yeah.
media saying, "Oh my God, we don't understand Middle America," could be leveraged, right? That the refs could be worked. And one of the things he did was they pressured the newspapers into hiring more Republican and conservative columnists. So that's how Pat Buchanan became a columnist. He'd been a Nixon speechwriter, had written some of these Agnew speeches. That's how William Safire became a New York Times columnist. And basically, his entire job at the New York Times was, smearing Democrats and making up stuff about Democrats. He was kind of like a, kind of highbrow Rush Limbaugh. And that was all a strategy. You can read the memos.
Well,
They
thank
called it
God nobody falls for that anymore.
Richard, like Nixon had an aide, Jeb Stuart Magruder, who went to jail for Watergate, and he wrote a memo saying, "Look, these networks all own TV. They own local TV outlets. We could threaten them with losing their FCC licenses. We can threaten them with antitrust." And so
But
this
but
is, you're right. This is, I mean, a lot of what you see. I mean, my theory is that had Richard Nixon not been caught in Watergate, a lot of what we're seeing now was actually written in the cards for Nixon's second term.
it was so interesting you bring up Watergate because like not long after the election of 72 when Nixon won again and 6 months into like this whole Washington Post report of Watergate,
Hmm.
there are these clips right there's a recording of Nixon from December of
Oh yeah,
72 where
right,
he's talking to his press secretary Ron Ziegler about how the White House should treat a certain press,
right.
a specific, very specific press moving forward. And so we'll just take a quick listen to that.
I want it clearly understood that from now on, ever, no reporter from the Washington Post is ever to be in the White House. Is that clear? Absolutely. Unless it's a press conference. Yes, sir. Now, the briefings here, but not a briefing. But never in the White House. No church service. Nothing that Mrs. Nixon does. You tell Connie, don't tell Mrs. Nixon because she'll approve it. No reporter from the Washington Post is ever to be in the White House again.
So we hear explicitly, Rick, that they're like blacklisting the Post. Now it's interesting
Hmm.
because they actually say, unless it's a press conference, so they do distinguish, but they're not allowed in the White House. They're not allowed to host,
Right,
they're not allowed to be a president other than like
right.
how did just thinking about how that compares so much to what we're seeing happen right now in real time with, Trump and the AP.
Banning the AP. Yeah,
Yes. I mean,
same.
so I mean, what's similar and what's different in how they weaponize access to the press between these two in a way?
Well, I mean, so much of what Donald Trump does takes the playbook that you see in previous Republican presidencies. There was something in the Nixon presidency called the Malek Manual. He had an aide named Fred Malek who created a manual about how you can fire civil servants because the deep state was this, nest of secret Democrats, right? And turns it up to 11, just, just takes it further and more brazenly than anyone had ever dreamed of before. I mean, George W. Bush, was a step along this same authoritarian ratchet. Do you remember what was his name? Guckert. There was some weirdo kind of right-wing blogger who got access to the White House press room and asked all the softball questions, you know. The same kind of, I mean, if you look at how they handled press in the Iraq War, um, public information officers were all suddenly Marines in uniform. And so you couldn't go on TV and ask tough questions of a Marine in uniform that wasn't, supporting the troops, right? So all these kind of stratagems, you see kind of just evolving. I mean, you have Mike Deaver in Ronald Reagan's presidency. He was considered the inventor and the master of the presidential photo op, right? Staging political events, so the lighting was perfect, so the background was perfect. The most famous one for Reagan was a campaign speech he gave in 1980 with, the Statue of Liberty in the background. The apotheosis of this for George W. Bush was, the mission accomplished,
Of
kind of
course.
staging, right? And then, with Donald Trump, like I say, he turns all this stuff, into the stratosphere, kind of turns it thermonuclear, and he's backed by, basically 50 years of a conservative Republican grassroots that's primed to understand the very act of independent attempts to figure out what is going on as a conspiracy against ordinary people, right? I am your vengeance, right?
Yeah,
They're not going after me, they're going after you. And who is they? They is, Jim Acosta. They is the Associated Press. You know, they is, anyone who
that's what I
wants to
interpreted as they
fulfill
is
their
whoever,
right.
yeah, whoever
They
you
is
want
the
it to be.
Jews, they is whoever want it to be, right? And it's the people who, I mean, I hate these, bumper stickers that say, if you love freedom, thank a soldier, obviously thank a journalist, right? Because you actually look at,
Hmm.
Oh my
hello.
God, yes, that's the bumper sticker. Yes. Oh my God.
Yeah, because I mean, literally, the people who founded this country, supposedly the people running the Supreme Court are quote unquote originalists. They're really into what the founding fathers supposedly originally want. But what they wanted was a press that was um, so venerated that newspapers could be sent out almost for free. There was almost no postage. That was one of the first laws Congress passed. And the reason was there was a debate, the big debate in Congress, in the 1780s, after the Constitution was, ratified, was whether postage for newspapers should be very, very cheap or postage for newspapers should be free. That was the debate because
Well,
they
isn't that how we got
literally,
the post office?
that was how we got the post office. It was the biggest part of the federal government. Literally, they believed in almost something like a socialized media, that the newspaper should not even be a business. It should be almost impossible for a newspaper to fail, right? And so anytime you see, some kind of, austerity measure and some kind of big news organization, I mean, Thomas Jefferson is rolling over in his grave. Thomas Jefferson, the guy who, whenever like a foreign emissary would come to visit him in the White House, would put out the most nasty, scabrous articles about him out in the antechamber so they could say, Mr. President, you seen what they're saying about you in these newspapers? What are you going to do? So he could troll them and say, no, that's what we do in America. We believe that people in power should be subject at all times to the most, freewheeling criticism. And that's what America is all about. So when you see, Donald Trump, kicking out the AP or going after a Jim Acosta or going after the very idea of a media that's independent of the political will of the dictator, you know that he is acting the very opposite of the people who founded this country's intention.
Well, I think we can leave the Nixon story on that.
I think I made you speechless.
Well, I
Don't
mean,
they teach you this in
It,
journalism school?
not like that. Not like that. And the part about, I mean, I knew that obviously, the post office and newspapers and their, founding of the country went hand in hand and et cetera. But the concept of newspapers were supposed to not fail,
Yeah.
that's not supposed to be
Really
something
only they
that's
only became
against democracy.
advertisers supported in like the second half of the second 19th century. Before that it was just, people would pay a little bit of money and get a newspaper and they printed whatever they want. Now, was journalism a little screwed up then? Sure. I mean, whatever.
Oh, yeah.
But at least, it was venerated and people understood, I mean, right wing, you can go to any right wing conference and you can buy a t-shirt that says rope tree journalists, some assembly required, right? And this is
Yeah.
from guys, these guys who are coming up with the system literally didn't want there to be a standing army. They didn't even want the nation to have an army, just militias, right? So clearly journalists, were more, I mean, whenever I, get in some ridiculous fight with some right winger on Twitter, I say, like literally this ICE agent was like, what qualifications do you have to make these criticisms? And I say, I'm the one sitting here on my couch typing, you know, um, that the people who founded this country considered heroes, you know? We're the good guys.
Oh my God. Anyway,
did
it's
they have
just
more
it's a lot to
control?
process.
Or my
Did they
quill
have more
pen.
control? Did they have more control? Was it seemed like there were like reading certain things like there was obviously the Washington Post being excluded from it all, but it seemed there was a lot of anger targeting broadcast news. They seem to be
Mm,
having like a, so I'm kind of curious, is that because it was reaching a larger audience
yes,
than
absolutely.
newspapers?
And it had such
So,
cultural authority.
and it's fascinating to kind of see how that kind of shifted because obviously we have another shift happening right now,
Right.
going from broadcast, like where nobody is paying attention to
No
broadcast
one
so
pays
much,
attention at all. Yeah.
everybody's now shifting to social media, going online, and whether it's TikTok and those things and how people can control the
Yeah.
narratives. Um, I guess it's kind of curious, how do you see
Yeah.
that sort of shaking out as
Well, yeah, so there was all this debate over whether, among Democratic strategists about whether Kamala Harris should go on Joe Rogan's podcast, right? Because
I
he's kind of a
remember.
clown and he kind of has all these, crackpots on. But the fact of the matter is, he also has millions of young men who hang on his every word. He kind of creates this kind of
33.4 million, if I remember
right,
correctly.
enormously trusted validator. And he's kind of like I could say he has a really open mind, but it's like so open that anything can kind of fall in and fall out, right? Because that's what his bag is, right? But
Mm.
I recently they had a profile by an article by the wonderful Andrew Merritt's in the New Yorker, and he talked about how the right wing has managed to cultivate this bro podcast world, which was pretty apolitical a few years ago. And he tells this absolutely terrifying story about how within the Harris campaign, they're like, maybe we should go on Joe Rogan because then we can get a really good headline the next day in the New York Times. So they're kind of still living in the 80s.
Mm.
All right, so that was just the first part of our conversation with Rick, which, of course, if you saw my face throughout that whole thing, I was absolutely shocked and indignant and just can't believe that we're still here. But as we kept going, our conversation then pivoted to the 80s and the Reagan years and Ronald Reagan's lasting impact on the press. And by the way, we didn't just talk about Republican presidents, we also got into some of the damage that the Democrats did as well. So come back next week for the rest of our conversation with Rick. Thanks a lot. Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Jenna Flanagan and Dominic Camia.
Music provided by Jake Howitt. Research by Laura Rothenbucker.
You can watch and follow us on YouTube.
Or you can listen and follow us wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you have any questions or suggestions, we want to hear from you. So leave a comment.
We do check them.
Or reach out to us anytime at laidoffandlookingpod@gmail.com.
New episodes every Friday.